So thank you very much indeed, Mark, for this nice presentation. So I will try to make it very short, but maybe to make it quite efficient. I don't know if some of you took part to the last conference on More Europe. Here in Brussels. It was really the best conference maybe ever on cultural diplomacy in the recent years, organized by the institutions, of course not by an independent think tank. And a lot of questions were raised at this occasion on culture, generally speaking. What strikes me most in this affair is that many people say culture is important nowadays and so on, but what is striking for us, I guess as an introduction, I would say, is that this motto of culture was written in the treaties since a very, very long time. As soon as 1957, you can see the mention of culture as a fundamental dimension of normally all policies. And this was completely forgotten during 50 years. So this must be very striking for us because, well, what happened? It's only a recent effort, a really late effort from the institutions after the end of the Cold War, after the beginning, let's say, of globalization, of serious globalization, that really the institutions started to do something. And now, since 7 years, since 2007 and the agenda for culture, we've got something moving on. But it took a very long time to do this. So now, where are we and where do we go? That are the questions I would like to answer briefly. First, maybe I would like to remind you the main goals of a cultural diplomacy. So what for a cultural diplomacy? Because not everybody, even among the European institutions, are convinced by the fact that cultural diplomacy is essential. Second, maybe the content of cultural diplomacy should be examined. So what do we put inside now? Because there are political debates on this, is there a right or left policy on cultural diplomacy? So we would like to examine it, and then maybe at the end I would like to say who is doing this cultural diplomacy. Is it just a matter of diplomats, of commissioners, or a new way to maybe empower the European citizens? So let me start with some remarks on the cultural diplomacy and the goals, the aims of a cultural diplomacy. I guess the main aim maybe nowadays, in 2014, on the eve of crucial elections, would be to deepen European values. It may seem quite simple, but let's start again from the text, from the treaties themselves. Definition of its own identity, peacekeeping, and international cooperation. That was mentioned since a long time ago. Yes, we have to assume these values and really to re-examine it in a contemporary way and to study their impacts. Yes, it has a clear definition and a clear impact on identity, on European identity, and even a unifying effect. Many people say culture tends to divide people. Well, there is a gap here nowadays in Europe between especially the West and the East, as mentioned before. And I guess a cultural diplomacy, and not only national policies, are a means to bridge this gap by promoting less well-known cultures. We have just mentioned a series of authors we don't all know here in this room, I guess. This is a unique opportunity because of Europe. If Lithuania alone does this job, well, it will be a difficult, I guess, task compared to the institutional old diplomacies in Britain or in Spain, in France, in Germany. This is an opportunity especially for Eastern countries. This is also a means to unify Europe on a social way. I was very in this conference because these social aspects were not examined. We make as if culture would be just a matter of an educated elite. This is a crucial mistake, and I guess this unifying tool should be used also in a social way. What I mean by social now, of course, is to promote an inclusive society, especially towards minorities. The question of minorities is very important, and maybe a kind of affirmative action also at this stage could be interesting by selecting some cultural ambassadors. Of course, they are not supposed to represent, for example, the Moroccan migrants, let's say, Morocco, but precisely the common culture between both sides of the Mediterranean Sea. And this would be an interesting direction, I guess, nowadays, and a vital one for migrants in Europe. Then it has to promote diversity, of course, but this is quite easy. I mean, many people say that, and this is not the problem. The problem is the question of attitude. In this conference, it was very interesting to see that many people insisted, like said before, on the attitude of speakers. Europe doesn't have to tell anymore a story, but to listen to the others. I agree somewhat to that because during a long time some diplomats, especially in France, but not only, a bit in other, embassies also, tend a bit to listen to themselves and to tell another story. And there is a risk here, of course, to be taken and considered as neo-colonialists. That's true. But on the other hand, I guess we have also to trust the content of European history. What I mean by trust is to be also self-confident. Self-confident doesn't mean being too affirmative, too assertive when we speak about culture, but being convinced that there is something like a European civilization. And especially when it is compared to other civilizations nowadays with globalization, this diplomacy should be a balance between a quite humble attitude, a quite soft power, but also positive speech to unify people inside. So I guess it is not only about a question of humility, but also of affirmation, of really a definition. And that's another aspect of this dealing with other partners to keep and maintain peace. And finally, maybe on the definition of the European values, I would like to insist on one that was completely forgotten, which is, of course, fundamental and now a priority, a top priority of the Commission, which is a strategy. I mean, cultural diplomacy is really a strategy to face geopolitical competition. Since the end of the Cold War, now cultural diplomacy is clearly a way to label Europe. So a lot of cultural professionals will say here, oh, come on, culture is something specific. It is not a global product. Yes, of course, but at the same time, it's true that we have a trend, a global trend, to build blocks, to build regional areas that promote themselves this way, that sell themselves this way. This be the case of Japan, South Korea, Asia, well, and China, of course. Be it the case, since a long time, of course, of the United States, and nowadays maybe of Brazil this year, and not only this year. Then Europe has really here to have a strategy. And this is a very interesting debate on the next treaty with the United States, because we understand here that it is not a question of business, of products, of norms, but of culture. At the moment, we only agree on some values. I guess it is urgent to agree on, let's say, a more complete series of values. So what do I mean by this? What is the content and what could be the content of a global European cultural diplomacy. I think there are two main options here. Many people say there is a low-cost cultural option. The low-cost option is already something. It's just about coordination. And coordination is already something because it could save money. And that's the main argument. The global total amount of all the institutes, cultural institutes in Europe, is above 2.5 billion. I guess you haven't heard about all the initiatives taken by these 29 institutes. Maybe here it is really an issue at stake to convince people and European national policy makers that here it is a means, this coordination, to gain invisibility and to have more impact on culture, globally speaking. Whereas at the moment we have a lot of ad hoc, isolated initiative, and this is fundamental. So it's even the low-cost option is a means to save money and to really have a common cultural diplomacy that addresses not only the issue of culture, but also other domains. Other policies are addressed by this, like, of course, exchanges and business, commerce and trade. It offers new jobs opportunities, but also, of course, it betters education. You are all young people, why not enlarging the process of Erasmus to high schools with Erasmus Zero, in a way? That will be a promotion, clearly, by this exchange of starting cultural diplomacy at school. That's a low-cost option because it doesn't, well, maybe there is a budget for this, but that's not a big investment. Other people suggest we should go further and pay a lot, invest a lot in cultural diplomacy. So the last budget, you know, is around 1.5 billion for Creative Europe only. And this is not the, all the budget for culture, but that's the latest figures for this domain. That's around 0.15% of the European budgets. So these are limited means, clearly, but at the same time, it offers an opportunity to go beyond. And I guess we shouldn't underestimate the value of this package. But what for, then, this money would be used? I guess that's beyond these political choices that are discussed by the European Parliament, among others. We have to find a minimum, series of minimum values and a content for this cultural diplomacy. If I rely again on the text and documents, I would say it's based on, first, common history, on common legacy. So that's, for example, museums, the heritage, the monuments, all these aspects, the landscapes of Europe, and so on. Common exchanges and common creations, and cultural diversity with the help of the UNESCO, the UNESCO, yes. So it's really a point here, I guess, to assume, to recognize the value of this European history, the legacy of ancient times, Christianity, the Renaissance, as mentioned before, the Enlightenment, the political and industrial transformations, and of course the legacy of the wars, including the Shoah itself, that make a European civilization different from others. And at least, I guess, on this point, on these issues, there should be a kind of, well, compromise. And clearly, I'm very surprised, for example, that religion disappears completely from all the meetings, all the discussions on European cultural diplomacy. Well, of course, the state and the policy of the state has to be neutral. It's part of the European legacy too. But at the same time, we can't ignore the role played by religion before. So I guess here there is a bit of kind of misunderstanding. We have really to take this as a legacy. It doesn't mean that we agreed with what was done before, with, of course, the world wars in the 20th century. But we have to celebrate or commemorate them together. How is it possible that the European Commission said this year, for the centenary of the First World War, it is not our business. We will let this to the states. And de facto, the states, each state, and even each region, like here in Flanders, organizes its own celebrations for the First World War. How would you build a cultural diplomacy based on this? It is just impossible. So I guess we have here to, with a role played by historians, scientists, some experts, but also by museums. They want to open here, you know, a new museum, the House of European History. They have a fundamental role to play to, well, build a kind of compromise. It's not a consensus. It's not the same vision of history. It has to offer diverse views on it, but at least it has to be, I guess, put forward. Otherwise, the risk is nationalism. I guess it's quite up to date. Or a kitsch history. So a reconstruction of a past that never existed, and we see that in some regions, a bit in Europe nowadays, where you invent or reinvent history, and you find again your origins because you are told to do so. If Europe doesn't do this, the regions will do this, the states will do this, but I guess in a worse way. So we have to be very careful here. And finally, I would like to insist on who then will do this cultural diplomacy. I guess first we need a fundamental change in the way cultural operators and professionals are chosen. At the moment, we have no many specialists. And I was wondering when listening to Mr. Dancis, well, it is not the role of artists to be diplomats, neither of philosophers, as Plato mentioned before, but at the same time, the appointment of cultural professionals for some positions in the European service, for example, or in some sections and fields of the European Commission, could be really a guarantee that some people will work with them. And I guess we have to choose very well-known people. Gérard Mortier, for example, has died lately, but I think about some writers or people who really made and led European cultural initiatives who are quite well-known and who could be really visible for Europeans to lead partly this cultural diplomacy. So I need here, I guess here, there is something to do. But behind this, behind the question of representation, there is also a work of a social work. I guess the problem of culture is nowadays the fact that it is completely scattered, and people have to find a place to, at the moment, or forums, to not to be only listened to, but to really create links like we are doing now. And maybe this is clearly the role of European institutions, based maybe on the cities of the year, on cultural forums or whatever, to create this kind of encounters so that these connections can appear and that projects can emerge from this. Erasmus was traveling a lot. With his own money. Maybe we can do something to sponsor the Erasmus program, but not for students, but for artists. So this will be improved clearly, I guess. This will improve European mobility. So I'm just finished with this. Of course, we have to mention the role of the new diplomatic services, and I guess they have really a role to play in this. They appointed somebody lately to act as a cultural ambassador and to coordinate all this, of course. Lately, I guess, maybe last but not least, the last actor of this change would be the cultural professionals themselves, and beyond this, maybe the European citizens. So European citizens have clearly here a role to play in this quite revolution of cultural diplomacy, as cultural diplomacy is not only a method of professionals, but also a question of common people, let's say, of citizens. You will tell me that, yes, but how are they empowered? Well, there are easy tools. At the moment, there is growing success for crowdfunding of cultural projects worldwide. Then it could be part of European programs and completely assumed. Now it is made by private firms and so on, but this kind of crowdfunding, for example, for national monuments, for national museums, for international or European places like Waterloo next year, maybe could be an opportunity to unite, and not only through petitions or so on. So, or elections with negative votes, which is only a negative definition of citizenship. So we would like to promote another one. So these are some points I collected from the last meetings of cultural diplomacy. Now, of course, it's open to discussion in the few minutes we have left before Mr. Ambassador speaks. I thank you very much. Do you have any questions on this? We can also answer this question a bit later. We have 3 days. It's just maybe to launch a debate that we may be answered a bit later. It has not to be questioned immediately. Do you have immediate questions, urgent questions, or protest, or critics, or really?
We have
yes,
one
please.
question. We can take that one, perhaps. Do you?
Yes. Yeah.
Please.
My name is Bonnie Shamaro from England, but I have a Swedish passport from Africa. So you hear that I'm one of the minority ethnic in Europe. My question is, that was a wonderful speech, but my worry is that in Europe, the more European countries they are united, the more they are now coming to extremism. So the typical example from in Ukraine, most of people, Europeans, they are supporting the pro-European bloc in the Ukraine government. But some of them, those who are pro-Russia, they are supporting pro-Russia and especially Russia government. Are we going, because the group of pro-Russia, they are accusing the actual government that they are pro-fascism. So what do we think, and what do you think that European supporting pro-extremism to be in the Ukrainian government? Or do you have any preventive cultural diplomacy to find a solution within Ukrainian crisis and also keeping this country united? Thank you. That's my question.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. We don't have much time for this. It's a whole debate on Ukraine. But you know, there were some attempts to play the piano at Maidan, to cross the bridges, and they failed. I guess they failed because the main content of my diplomacy of there would be based on history. That's fascinating. But a lot of Ukrainians have completely forgotten the 30s, when Ukraine was completely starved. 6 billion people died, just to remind you, because of their relation with the Soviet Union. So they were absolutely, and this has completely forgotten. And on the opposite, they put forward the fact that some people in Ukraine welcomed the Nazis when they arrived, because they were under, well, a totalitarian regime. So we have to keep that in mind. If you study, if you have a close study of the facts, but only through history and historical education, then you can maybe move on these issues and show that history is not, I would say, between good and evil. This is much more complicated. History textbooks and the teaching of history seems to me very important, especially in Ukraine. We all learn that. We know that in Western Europe, we learn that in textbooks at school. This is not mentioned in Ukraine, and many pro-Russian. They don't care. They absolutely don't care about what happened in the 20s, but it is not supposed to be the guilt of the regime at the time, and the 30s, which was a deliberate politics to kill some people. So I guess we have to have a balanced vision of history. That will be my answer, and we are far from it at the moment. But okay, maybe we can complete this answer a bit later on. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Maybe a round of applause to express our gratitude.